when I would get up at testimony meeting, I wouldn't usually start by blushing. So I want to introduce you to my family. This is the summer before COVID at Lagoon. So on the left-hand side is our son, Nelson. He's 28 years old. And next to him is his partner, Jaden. They've been together about 6 years now. And my dear wife, Susan, she's a nuanced active believer in the church and a temple ordinance worker. And then next to her, between her and me, is our daughter, Rachel. She's working on a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in ballet, as well as a BFA in modern dance, and is supposed to graduate this coming May. So that's our family. What I hope to do today is share a little bit about my story from feedback that I've received. I think that a good percentage of you that are here might have heard some version of my story, so I'll give an abbreviated version so as to not repeat a whole lot. And then also direct you to different places of things that I have participated in. So the blog that I write at is unpackingambiguity.com. Sometimes I'm more active posting things there than other times. One of the first podcast episodes I did was with Gina Colvin for the A Thoughtful Faith podcast, and there's a story that I shared in that podcast episode that I'll refer to today. I spent some time in a couple podcast episodes with Glenn Ostlund, but the one that's relevant is number 569. And then I've been on Mormon Stories a fair amount. The episodes that have my own personal interview and story are episodes 1159 through 1165. But I've done other episodes about different topics, like navigating your first Christmas after a faith crisis, or building and nourishing spirituality after a faith crisis. I participated, as Sarah mentioned, in 13 episodes with the Mormon Discussion podcast with Bill Reel, Alan Mount, and quite a few guests as well to unpack personal experiences with the Gospel Topics essays. And we've covered all of the main Gospel Topics essays except for the Book of Abraham one and the one on Joseph Smith, Women in the Priesthood. So we still need to do those. The one that I'm participating in more recently it's been really meaningful to me is the Almost Awakened podcast with Bill Reel. So Bill Reel, Janice Spangler, Brett Hartley, and I are going through kind of almost like a book club, and we're unpacking the different sessions or chapters in Jack Kornfield's audiobook called Buddhism for Beginners. And it's been really meaningful to me, and I'm really grateful to have participated in this series. We haven't released episode 83, which will be the last one, but we'll be releasing that sometime in the next 2 weeks. I did an episode on marriage on a tightrope after a Salt Lake City earthquake and Moroni being damaged. That was kind of fun. Everyone was trying to attribute meaning to that. And then the Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium was really significant in my personal experience of healing and developing community and to feel like I'm not going insane. And in fact, actually to extract me from the dark night of the soul part of my faith journey. And I went back in 2017 and moderated sessions, and then since then every year I've either presented or co-presented in sessions every year at the Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium. And so eventually those sessions are available for free online for anyone that wants to look at those. But we've talked about things like navigating a mixed faith marriage, communicating across faith and belief, post-orthodox spirituality. And the more recent year, I was on a panel where we talked about the current state of support groups like this one, or the one in Billings, Montana, and what we think the future of these kinds of groups might look like. And then as Sarah mentioned, I presented at the Thrive Conference in 2019, and I did a presentation on growing through and past grief related to a faith crisis. And I subsequently then presented that on Mormon Stories in episodes 11, 66, and 67, and it's on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast as well. So those are some things about me. So abbreviated, I'm going to introduce you to a couple things that most of you have all heard before, but to provide context for my personal experience. So first, forgive yourself for not knowing what you didn't know before you learned it, right? So we, anyway, you know what it means. It's good to be reminded. All right. So in my TED Talk, it's only going to be able to be 12 minutes long, so I'm not going to be able to cover a whole lot. But what I want to express to people is how people of faith in Mormonism arrive at a sense of what something being true is, and what truth means. Is it objectively true, like you can test it? Is it falsifiable? Or is it subjectively true? John Ogden talks about truth being related to goodness, beauty, and meaning, for example, in his book, When Mormons Doubt. So there's different meanings that people attribute to truth. In Mormonism, the meaning that I attributed to truth is that if I had experiences, that those experiences meant that something was objectively true, right? Instead of using the scientific method to figure out if something is true, instead of determining whether it's falsifiable, I had experiences, and based on those experiences, I attributed meaning of truth in a way without applying the same kinds of critical analysis or thinking that I apply in my business, doing real estate development, or in my financial planning practices, or tax planning, and things like that. So I applied totally different metrics of how I attributed meaning to truth. So one element of how people perceive truth is the illusory truth effect. So the illusory truth effect is the tendency to believe something is true or valid when it has been repeated or rehearsed multiple times, regardless of whether it's actually true or the validity of the thing. So we get practiced in doing that, right? So in Mormonism. So everybody knows the script of what the youth say, in the primary. You know the church is true, Joseph Smith the prophet, all that kind of stuff. And so we say it over and over again. I remember over the years, there was a period of time that I spent on the High Council. And I remember I was asked to give a lesson one day. And in our state High Council meeting that we would have every Sunday. And the lesson that I wanted to engage with the other members of the High Council and the state presidency with was how did you come to know or recognize the influence of the Spirit, and did someone help you do that? So for example, in my own personal journey, I felt very strongly that I needed to go on a mission because of an experience that I had at a Young Life youth camp. It's a non-denominational Christian youth camp. It was suggested to me one evening, as well as the other members of the camp, that we would go out into the woods in Northern California where the camp was and pray to seek a connection with God and Jesus. And I did that, and I was a believing member of the church, the only one there at the camp, and I went out and I prayed, and I got this distinct impression very strongly that I needed to serve a mission. Because God loved these people just as much as he loved everyone else. And so I had a role in this life to serve others, and the perception that I had is that I needed to serve a mission. Later on, I told my dad, Dad, I know I need to serve a mission, but I don't know if the church is true. Like, how can I go teach that the church is true if I don't know that? And he said, well, why don't you try Moroni's Promise? Why don't you read the Book of Mormon? I was 18, 19 years old at the time, almost 19. Read the Book of Mormon, pray about it, ponder it, and then let's talk about it. So I would read it, I'd pray about it, I would ponder it, and after a week or so, my dad asked, how's it going? And I said, I like it. He asked, so when you read it, how do you feel? I said, well, I kind of feel an increased sense of love in my heart, and I feel kind of a warmth inside of me when I read it and ponder about it. And he asks, what do you think that is? And I'm like, yeah, that must be the Holy Ghost. He's like, right. I'm like, is that what that is? Like, I felt that before, like in seminary a couple times and like at youth camp and stuff. He says, yeah, that's probably what it is. So why would you be feeling it? I'm like, I guess because God is telling me this is true. He's like, yeah. He's like, okay, so what do you need to do about that? I'm like, well, I guess I need to go teach people that this is true. So it was a leading conversation without malintent. But what my dad helped me do is recognize that I had feelings, and then the meaning that he attributed to those feelings was that that was God. And the meaning that he attributed to those feelings being divine or being God was under the construct that those feelings represented a reliable divine witness of truth. So I got really good at, as a missionary, helping people feel that. And then leading them through that discussion. I would open scriptures, the fruits of the Spirit, and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm ahead of myself. But when I'm going to get to that in a second. But when I had this lesson with the people on my House Council, I asked them how many of them had that kind of an experience where somebody helped them identify what that feeling was. And almost none of them had that. Almost everyone in the High Council said, well, I just knew it was true. And I just knew that experience, what that was. And now, I think it's because they experienced this. Because all their life, they grew up with that. And then, of course, when we become a youth, we're told Dallin Oaks shared in April 2008, is another way to seek testimony seems astonishing when compared with the methods of obtaining other knowledge. Not astonishing. We gain or strengthen a testimony by the bearing of it. So I believe that because if I was sharing testimony and I would feel good about it, then that means what I was saying was true, right? If I was teaching a Sunday school lesson and I felt good about it and I felt spiritually connected to the people in my class, that's what that meant. So we all experience this. This is why Brian Tracy, in his sales training, he tells salespeople that when they're driving to an appointment, they should say, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself, I like myself. By the time you get to the front door, you're so enthusiastic and you're so excited to be alive because the illusory truth effect works, right? If I'm wanting to lose weight, which I could lose 20 pounds, when I'm running on the treadmill, I could say to myself over and over again what I'm accomplishing. And the more that I do it, the more I will believe it, and it increases my capacity to do it. So the illusory truth effect works for a lot of things. So what about this thing? Elevation emotion. Jonathan Haidt talks about elevation emotion. He wrote the book, The Righteous Mind, The Coddling of the American Mind. The text is too small so you can't see it, but Michael Ferguson studies brain activity and stuff like that. He gave a TED talk that I'd recommend for everyone to watch called Your Brain on God. And what he did is in Salt Lake City, this is a picture from his TED talk. In Salt Lake City, what he did is he got people from different denominations and he put them in a functional MRI machine that would measure the brain activity, where their electrical, neurological brain activity would happen. And he was able to, before people would get in the MRI machine, they would pray, they would listen to sacred hymns, they would listen to conference talks, or from their religious tradition or believers. And what he was able to identify is the parts of the brain that get lit up when people have a connecting spiritual experience, a God experience. He also, as well as Jonathan Haidt, explained that when we have that kind of experience, what happens is there's a hormonal release in our system called of the hormone dopamine. And that dopamine, when it gets released in our system, that is what causes that warmth in your core. And that hormone increases our charitable disposition and our tolerance for others. So the elevation emotion is a very important part of human cultural and individual biological and social evolution, because what happens is when we witness or participate in virtuous acts of remarkable moral goodness, we experience a distinct feeling of warmth, expansion in one's core that is often accompanied by a sensation of appreciation, an increased charitable disposition, and increased tolerance for others. And it corresponds with increased neurological brain activity. I've already said that, but in any event, when I eventually get a tattoo, that's going to be my first one. It's the symbol of dopamine. Because I love the elevation emotion, right? I love that sense of warmth. And I love that sense of connection. And whether it's God, or whether it's spirit, or divinity, or dopamine, I don't care. I like that thing, right? I like participating in things that I perceive are moral goodness. We lost that one there. And I like having that sense of connection, right? Just like there are other hormones that happen, like when I spend time with my wife, right? There's oxytocin, there's other kinds of things that happen. All right. So in religious texts, there are constructs that can explain how I could come to believe what I believed, or even attribute a meaning of knowing to something based on a feeling. So the Apostle Paul talks about the fruits of the Spirit being love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. That's a scripture that my dad used with me, and it's a scripture that I used as a missionary to be a successful missionary. In Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith, this is supposed to be God speaking through Joseph Smith, says, "But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind, and then ask me if it is right. And if it is right, I will cause that your bosom shall burn within you, therefore you shall feel that it is right." And in Doctrine and Covenants 11, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, I will impart unto you my spirit, which shall enlighten your mind and fill your soul with joy." And I'm not going to read all of Moroni's promise, but what Moroni says, essentially, is if you read these things and ponder in your heart remarkable acts of moral goodness of God, you'll feel the Spirit. Right? I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, but it worked for a lot of people, and it worked for me. And the construct for that experience is that it means something is true. Not just spiritually subjectively true, but objectively true. So Elder Ballard says, the print's small, so I'll read it. It was a conference, it was a talk in 2007. He says, "You will not know whether the Book of Mormon, you will not know it, whether the Book of Mormon is true by trying to prove it archaeologically or by DNA or anything else. Religious truth is always confirmed by what you feel." And our friend Tad Callister, who is very much on the not black and white scale, just straight up black and white thinking, he says the Spirit is the decisive determining factor, not archaeology, not linguistics, not DNA, and certainly not the theories of man. The Spirit is the only witness that is sure and certain and infallible. Infallible. Right? So, we'll talk about that in a second. So Brene Brown talks about this experience. She doesn't call it elevation emotion, but she calls it spirituality, a connection that we experience, whether it's with other people or in nature, witnessing or participating in remarkable acts of moral goodness, in doing good. Brene Brown says spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power that is greater than all of us. Whether it's dopamine or whatever it is that you want to call it, we're connected. And that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. Practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives. So let me jump to this slide right here. The text is small, I'll just explain it. on a scale of things, there are, I'm going to walk out of it for a minute. On the scale of things, there are exterior sources of determining truth, and there are interior ones. And there are individual experiences with it relate to truth, and they're collective. And so some people experience truth as being subjectively, individually true. So for example, I read this, I teach this lesson, I feel the fruits of the Spirit. That must mean that it has beauty and goodness and connection. Or maybe I attribute meaning like Tad Callister and say, that means it's not only true for me, it's not only true for me, it's true for Wayne. And not only is it true for Wayne, it's true for everyone, because I had an individual subjective experience. And then I'm going to hold this construct. That means it's objectively true for everyone. And if I'm Tad Callister, I believe then that it's infallible. Right? Now, any of you that have studied like the Race and the Priesthood essay knows that there's a problem with that. Because for more than 125 years, leaders of the church had spiritual witnesses about the truthfulness of things they called doctrine that are now disavowed. Completely disavowed. Well, not completely. Only by the brethren and the people who have read the essay. There are lots of people who haven't read the essay who still think that those things that were taught are objectively true. All right. So next, the Honda Accord. The Honda Accord, that's really dark, but that's a picture of a Honda Accord underneath. The Honda Accord is the most commonly driven and registered vehicle on the road today. And how confirmation bias works is that if you've never driven or ridden in a Honda Accord, it's about as bland as that car that's right there, which is a Honda Accord. And while you see other cars on the road, you don't recognize them as Honda Accords. But once you buy and start driving one, something flips in your brain and you see them everywhere. Like that happened to me and our family when we got a Subaru. I'm like, holy crap, there's a ton of Subarus out there. And before I didn't, I recognized that there were cars, but I didn't recognize them as Subarus. And what happens is confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms or supports one's prior beliefs or values. The effect is the strongest for desired outcomes, for emotionally charged issues, and for deeply entrenched beliefs. So the way confirmation bias works is if you have a really strongly held belief, you might physically not be able to see how all the disconfirming evidence. Like you could show someone, here's all this disconfirming evidence, and they can't even see it. You could say the Honda Accord is the most commonly driven vehicle on the road. X% of the cars in this county are Honda Accords. And if people tried to see them all and point them out, they couldn't. Because that's how our brains work. That's why scientists do peer review studies. Because they know that when they develop a hypothesis and they test things, that they're coming from a place of confirmation bias. And so why they do peer review studies is perhaps people who don't hold the same belief can test that, not to prove them wrong, but because scientists realize that this is how confirmation bias works. Now, how does that work in faith? Well, if you and I have read the Race and the Priesthood essay and the things that about racism, Marky Peterson's stuff, the book Mormon and the Negro, or just read cited source number 9 in the Race and the Priesthood essay, where Brigham Young says, I will remark with regard to slavery, inasmuch as we believe in the Bible, inasmuch as we believe in the ordinances of God, in the priesthood and the order and decrees of God, we must believe in slavery. In the cited source for the essay, Brigham Young testifies the day after establishing Utah as a legal slave territory with God-ordained slavery. In his speech, he advocates blood atonement by decapitation for mixed race marriage, as well as post-birth. So this isn't abortion, this is post-birth mixed race offspring, decapitated, right? So you know, if you've studied these things, there was slavery in Utah. There was trafficking of indigenous kids for money as slaves in Utah. So you know this happened, right? But Elder Morrison of the 70 in 2000 says, "How grateful I am that the Church of Jesus Christ has from its beginning stood strongly against racism in any of its malignant manifestations." Or in our recent conference, Quentin Cook said, "One of the reasons for the violent opposition to the members was that most of them were opposed to slavery." Now, it's true that the Missourians didn't like that there were some Mormons that were against slavery. But the opposition against the Mormons was a tit-for-tat, violent, escalating violence, and it was way more complicated than that. But if somebody approaches something with confirmation bias, they might actually believe this, that this is why. Because they read all the messiness and then that's all they can see because that's what's affirming to their faith. Now, former area authority, I think it was in the second or third quarter of the 70s, Hans Monson, wrote the book Truth Seeking. And at his presentation at the Thrive Day in November of 2019, he shared that one thing that tends to happen, a bias that we have, is when something's serendipitous, when we pray for something, and something that happens that's serendipitous, and it's for our favor, we remember that as a witness that God is interventionist and does that stuff for us, right? But the way our brains work is we don't remember all the times that it didn't work out that way. So there's like a survivor bias of what we remember. Serendipitous things do happen, right? But if we're operating with confirmation bias, it might be physically impossible for us to really consider all the times that it doesn't work out that way, you know? And then maybe we come up with ideas. So there's an auto accident and someone doesn't get hurt. Well, it's because they did their home teaching. If they do get hurt, it was because, well, maybe they didn't do their home teaching. But if they did their home teaching, it's because God was testing them, right? It's not falsifiable that, you know, the expression of faith is because people have a need to attribute meaning to things. And when they perceive that it's a remarkable act of moral goodness, they feel a sense of connection to it. And when people get up and they share their testimony, and we hear it over and over again, and we get up and share our testimony, and we hear it over and over again, we have a hard time disbelieving it because of the illusory truth effect. All right. So one more thing, here's an example of what I was talking about. In April of 2016, there were storms and like a hurricane around the Houston Temple, and in LDS Living, they printed the temple grounds flood after the major storms in Texas. The temple remained remarkably untouched, so God prevented the floodwaters from entering the temple. And then a year later, well, a year and a few months, in August of 2017, LDS Living posted an article of the Houston Temple flooding. And so, with confirmation bias, it's hard to not see divinity in both of them, because that's what that symbol means to us, right? That's why we have that sense of connection. All right, so now I'm going to tell some of my story, and then I'm going to tell what happens when confirmation bias flips. So the church worked so well for us. Like, I'm an extrovert, I'm male, I've only been married once. Like, it's perfect. I'm a professional, I'm educated, like, I'm the brethren. You know, I'm an entrepreneur, like my mission president was an entrepreneur, right? And growing up, my parents divorced, my dad committed adultery. He has no idea how many times, he can't remember. It was awful. We were always poor. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And the church took care of us. It was amazing. I had father figures, I had scout leaders that acted like father figures. The ward would come and help me trim trees away from the house that we were living in. We were living in this old farmhouse that had a wooden foundation that we could hear the cats running underneath it. In Mesa, Arizona, it was super hot. I didn't have a bedroom. I slept on the couch. There was one room in the house that had a window air conditioning unit in Mesa, Arizona. And the ward would come and help us trim trees away from the house so that when the branches fell, they didn't damage the house. And that family that the ward adopts for Christmas, that was our family. How could you not experience a sense of divinity in those things? I did. And I went on a mission, and what my dad led me through in helping people identify the Spirit, I did that. I went to Barcelona, Spain, and I'm not saying this to brag. I'm saying this because this is what I've learned and how well the church worked for me. I baptized 25 people in Spain, and my companions on average baptized less than 2 during their 2-year period. The church worked for me, and I took these things and I implemented them, and I helped people feel the Spirit, or I helped people feel dopamine, or I helped people feel spiritual connection, but I gave them a narrative of what that meant. It means something different to me now, but it meant so much to me then, right? I treasure those experiences. I came home from my mission, and by the time I was 30, I was on the High Council, and then I was High Priest Group Leader, and I taught gospel doctrine for a total of about 9 years, and I was a temple ordinance worker. I had experiences in the temple that made me believe that my deceased friend was standing next to me as I was bringing his widowed wife through the veil of the temple, and I was acting on his behalf. Because I was experiencing Spirit, or whatever it is that you want to refer to it, and the construct that I had, the filter that I had, was it meant that Scott was standing next to me as I was bringing his wife through the veil. It worked for me. I would, before a Sunday school lesson, I would pray that God would help me know what to emphasize in the lesson so that I could be an instrument in his hands to make a difference in the lives of the people in my class. And I would shake people's hand as they walk into the room, and I would give a prayer in my heart so that I could sense whether God wanted me to emphasize a particular part of the lesson. And there was positive feedback loops, because people would come after me. They would come up after the lesson to me, or sometimes they would even write handwritten notes, and they said, that thing that we emphasized or talked about today, thank you so much for that. That's exactly what I needed, right? And if this experience of participating in witnessing remarkable acts of moral goodness works to feel that sense of connection, it worked for me. And I just got positive feedback loop over and over again, to the extent that I would say, I know. Now, I had lots of questions, because I'm analytical. And my shelves, there wasn't one shelf. There were like many shelves. And they were full. Like the Kirtland dedicatory prayer, the problem with the Tower of Babel, even though there were 50 to 60 million people on the earth when that was supposed to happen, stuff like that. My shelves were packed full. But I knew that when I read the Book of Mormon, or I participated in these things, I had that feeling. And the only thing that I had for that feeling was that was God. And if you study secular Buddhism, or if you study mindfulness practices, what happens as human beings, we tend to enmesh our sense of personal identity in our forms. Eckhart Tolle would say our attachment to forms. Our roles, our identity, our beliefs, it becomes all enmeshed inside of us. And what that construct was for me that was how I knew God. Until April 29th, 2016. Our then 22-year-old son came out to us as gay. And I couldn't shelve that God would want him to live a life absent the kinds of comfort and intimacy that my wife and I share. Couldn't shelve it. So I went online to search for resources as to how an active believing member, like I was going to retire early and my wife and I were going to serve missions for the rest of our lives. Like this, we moved to Billings, Montana, and it was going to be a short stay because they didn't have a temple, and my patriarchal blessing says that I would spend my life serving in the temple. And then a temple was announced like within a year of us moving there, right? Answer to prayer, right? And in any event, my son comes out to us. I search online, how do I support him? And that evening I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays that I had always been led to believe were anti-Mormon lies. And for some reason, something happened with my confirmation bias. Because I was able to see things in those essays that I might not have seen if our son had to come out to us that day. I think eventually I would have. It's kind of like if you read these books about archaeology with regard to the Bible, or how the Pentateuch came to be, the 5 books attributed to Moses, or how and why the scholarship, the New Testament came to be. It's a little bit messier, just take my word for it, than what we got taught on Sunday. And if you read these things, right, we, as human beings, we experience a sense of spirituality, connection, and we might even attribute a sense of divinity to these things. But if you learn this scholarship and then you go back and read the Book of Mormon, you see that New Testament is the Book of Mormon is the New Testament. It's the Christology of John that didn't exist until like 100 CE, but it's the 5 books attributed to Moses didn't exist on when the brass plates are supposed to happen. The law of Moses wasn't developed until around the time during the Babylonian exile. The Nephites could not have practiced the law of Moses because it didn't exist yet. It wasn't developed yet. The story of the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve is something that was developed during and after the Babylonian exile, when Yahweh was being morphed into a monotheistic deity, right? That doesn't mean that people don't experience divinity in those things. But when your confirmation bias, like when you start driving the Honda Accord, you see them everywhere. So I don't know what happened, but that night I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays, and while reading the Race and the Priesthood essay, and I was 12 in 1978, and I remember when this happened. And I remember friends whose families left the church over this in Mesa, Arizona. Like some people are having a hard time over what the brethren are saying now about vaccines and stuff like that, right? Back then it was blacks got the priesthood, and so people left the church. They thought it was an apostasy. So I remember that stuff, and I remember what was being taught, and it wasn't theories. It was testified of as doctrine. And I read Brigham Young's talks, and I recognized while I was reading the essay that my spiritual experiences, that I had spiritual experiences about things that were partially or entirely inaccurate. And I recognized that the brethren for over 125 years did the same thing. And I recognized that today's brethren were disavowing the testimonies and proclaimed doctrines of past brethren, which meant that future brethren could do the same to today's brethren. And probably will. They'll be like a new family proclamation kind of thing. At some point. Either that or the church is going to drop from 5 million active members to 3 million to 1.5 million at some point. If they don't fix some of the LGBTQ issues and women issues and so forth. And in the moment that I recognized that my spiritual experiences were something else, the heavens closed. And God ceased to exist on me because it was so traumatic, because that was part of my identity. And not only did I lose God in that moment, but I lost myself. When someone you deeply love and care about dies, one of the reasons that it's so painful is it feels like some of you is gone. That person is part of your identity, and that person is gone. And that's what happened to me that night that I read the Race and the Priesthood essay. It was acute. It was very painful. I felt like I was falling. Like the rabbit hole analogy, I felt like I was falling in that moment because my construct shifted. And when my construct shifted of what spiritual experiences were, it was so painfully traumatic that as a self-protection measure, my body shut that part off, right? And I had to heal from that trauma before I could begin to feel God or divinity or dopamine or whatever it is that you want to call it, before I could feel that again. Because I had to reconstruct a different meaning for that before I could feel it again. And I had to process the trauma of recognizing that it wasn't what I thought it was. And as I read the balance of the essays, I found myself in an acute existential faith crisis, and I anxiously tried to make the church true again. So I searched for reviews of the essays, and I found Mormon Thing. I don't know if you've read Mormon Thing before. It's not helpful. If you're trying to put the genie back in the bottle, because they do reviews of this stuff, right? And so then I searched and I found Mormon stories, and I watched Tyler Glenn's interviews, and I watched Jeremy Reynolds' interviews. This was like a 3-day weekend with almost no sleep. Not just my iPad open, I got my computer open, I got my iPad open. I'm like, feel like I'm falling. And grieving also all the idea that my son would call me and say, okay, Dad, I'm active again. Why don't you come down for my patriarchal blessing? Or why don't you come down to Logan to ordain me an elder? Like, I was grieving that too, right? We responded exactly as we needed to our son. We were like, that doesn't matter. You might as well have told us that your eyes were a different color, right? We feel the same about you regardless. But there was something to mourn there too. Anyway, that weekend I watched those, and then Jeremy Reynolds talked about the CS letter, and so I read that. And then he talked about debunking it. So then I found Fair Mormon's big list of things. Holy crap, there's a lot of things on that list. So I read their debunking, and that was not helpful. And I'm like, this is the best we have. And in any event, I was in acute existential faith crisis. Some people are hesitant to call it a faith crisis. Like, it was an existential crisis because I had lost not only my constructs for divinity, but not only my constructs for what my spiritual experiences meant, for all these things, for my purpose in life. I had lost my moral identity, and it was bad. I experienced depression, disassociation. I asked my wife, am I the same person I was anymore? Like, because why would God not answer me? I would spend hours a day in prayer pleading with God, please help me understand what's happening. I would read scriptures for hours a day trying to make sense of things. But all I saw were the Honda Accords. I'm like, oh, that's in the scriptures. I shelved that. That's in the scriptures. I shelved that too. Darn it. I went to a Sunday school lesson. It was about Ammon, where he cuts all the arms off. Remember that story? It's total BS, right? Because they didn't have steel swords. And number two, like, you'd have to have like more than a chainsaw to like slice off like a whole bunch of people's arms. Like, it doesn't work, right? But in that, in that lesson, I'm sitting there in Sunday school. I'm sitting next to the temple president, who's my former stake president, and I was served with him in the High Council, and he told me I'd be a bishop someday. Oops. I'm sitting in, we're having this lesson, it's about Ammon, and in that chapter, there's something about horses and chariots, oops, and there's something about the skin curse, darn it. And I follow the footnote, and of course it takes me to 3rd Nephi, where in this year this happened, in this year this happened, and then the Lamanites were righteous, and they became white. And then the next year, really? That's not how that works. So I'm sitting there during this lesson, having this mental breakdown, sitting next to my wife on one side and my temple president on the other. He's like, "How you doing?" I'm like, "Not good." And he's like, "You and your wife, it's time for you to come to the temple," because they were changing it so that my wife could serve at the temple, even though we still had a child at home. I'm like, "Oh, maybe." I sent him an email. I said, "I'm like so sorry. I stumbled across the Gospel Topics essays, and I don't believe anymore. And I'm trying to put things back together, and I don't know what to do." And he responded to my email that, "Man, that's got to be tough. But have faith. Come to the temple, fill the Spirit." I'm like, okay. All right. So over the subsequent weeks, one of my best friends was my stake president. He was involved in a office development, complex development with me, and he was my stake president. And I finally went to him, I'm like, "Spencer, man, like, I read the Gospel Topics essays, I don't believe, I've lost God, I don't know what to do, I can't make it true again." And he told me this example. He says, "Imagine your life was amazing, and you developed this 1,000-piece puzzle, you put together this 1,000-piece puzzle on the table, and it was all prescripted to you, and it told you how life worked and meaning worked and everything. And what's happened to you is, for no fault of your own, that 1,000-piece puzzle of meaning and purpose and life got thrown onto the floor." I'm like, "Oh yeah, it's on the floor right there." And he's like, "What you're going to do now is you're going to pick up one piece at a time, and you're going to look at it, and you're going to sit with it, and you're going to think about it. And if it doesn't work for you anymore, you're going to set it aside. And if it's something that you think that could work for you in the future, you're going to put it back on the table. And over time, you're going to accumulate pieces on puzzle pieces on your table, and you're going to build your own puzzle. And it's going to be a lot smaller than the old one. But it's going to be more meaningful because it's going to be a puzzle that you built." I'm like, I can't even pick up one piece, right? That's where I was. But that was a helpful analogy, because it actually ended up being what happened. So eventually I got help. I explained this in my Mormon Stories interview. I went to breakfast with Lindsay Hansen Park. She told me she helped me out a ton. She was the first person that I really told in person my whole story to, who could hold it and understand what I was going through. She says, "You need to come to Sunstone." And I'm like, "A place for all the nerdy, fringy people?" She's like, "Yeah, you'll fit right in." And so I did. And so I went and I started to heal. And things shifted inside of me. And I could feel it again. But it was too triggering to call it God. Like Gina Colvin says, sometimes they say God leaves the corner of the room where you knew him. I'm like, that's a good, eloquent way to put it. But I started to feel that connection again. But it was too triggering to call it God at that time, but I started to feel it again. And over time, it never returned to the corner of the room where I knew it. And I've attributed different meanings to those experiences now. But I still sense that connection. I still, if I go hike in the mountains, and if I spend time with you, if I listen to someone share their story of grief, that's a sacred moment to me. I feel that again. But it doesn't mean that I ignore DNA and archaeology and science and reason, right? Because it's a subjective experience. It's a subjective truth, and the truth is that it has goodness in it. Not that it's objectively, because I felt something, you have to believe that Bigfoot is Cain, or that Tater's Rorschach, or that God cares about green tea. Now, it doesn't always happen like this, but I love the Naked Pastor. He's a deconstructed evangelical. There's a graph on the left-hand side that says how hard you believed, and on the bottom, how hard you deconstruct, and it goes straight up. Like, it's not for everyone, but that's how it worked for me. Like, I believed really hard, and I deconstructed. Like, I tried to put together a list of the top 25 books, and that was hard, because I've probably read at least 100 trying to figure things out. Or how much I miss church versus how much I realize I can't go back. Like, I can't go back. And if I went back, all my friends would have left because they'd think it was an apostasy. Because, like, women would have priesthood, LDS atonement theology would be gone. Like, this idea that you're constantly, perpetually unworthy and you need to access God through men. You know? And there's another way of looking at God. Here's a way. Instead of belief being in the cup, it's everywhere. Connection and meaning is everywhere, right? Or if you use the word God anymore, instead of God filling the church is just a speck across all things, right? That's another way that some people attribute meaning. So I found people that helped me put in work. Sarah Hughes Zavala moved to Billings, Montana. She's a therapist. She works with Symmetry Solutions, Natasha Helfer Parker's group. And she put together in one of our Sunstone presentations, she, Jana Spangler, and I participated, but we talked about this, but this is Sarah's work. So she made a list of these are the things that made me feel spiritually connected when I was believing. So you might recognize some of those: community, charity, journaling, contemplation, things like that. And then the list of things where I feel connected: post-orthodoxy. Wait a second. That was supposed to be funny. Actually, it's almost the same. You know, so if I felt a sense of connection and divinity teaching gospel doctrine, that activity is something that I can sense a connection and meaning in having contemplative experiences about life and meaning with others still. If I experience a sense of connection and meaning with music, maybe I'm not going to listen to the Motab or whatever it's called anymore. But I can experience a sense of connection and elevation emotion or divinity, whatever it is you want to call it, music again. There may be psilocybin. I don't know, I haven't tried it yet, but there are ways that you can reconstruct a sense of meaning and spirituality and connection. And one way to look at this is, as you deconstruct, there's different kinds of ways of looking at things. There's pre-rational thought, rational thought, and trans-rational thought. So pre-rational thought is when you get people, say around 500 BCE during the Babylonian exile, and they're putting together these texts that they aggregate into the 5 books attributed to Moses, and like, that epic of Gilgamesh flood story is amazing. So let's adapt it, and let's put this like 600-year-old guy in it that has kids, and he builds a boat and puts animals in it, a zoo in it. And in the story, we're going to explain what rainbows are. And in the story, a rainbow, when you see the rainbow, you experience a sense of connection, and that was God made the rainbow. And the rainbow is a promise that God won't kill everyone that he created again. I shelved that one. And then rational thought happens where you learn that a rainbow is when there's moisture in the air and light refracts through it. That's what a rainbow is. It's not a promise that God's not going to kill you and your kids and your dad and Fido. And then transrational thought, sometimes we get stuck in there when we're deconstructing. Transrational thought is where I'm running out. Yeah, the other one. Transrational thought is when you know that a rainbow is light refracting through moisture in the air, and you see the rainbow and you still sense divinity and connection to it, and that's okay, right? Transrational thought is when you learn that the story of the woman taken in adultery wasn't added to New Testament texts until about 500 CE, and it's not historical, but that it's a beautiful story anyway, right? So transrational thought is recognizing that life is messy, this is what happened to us, holy crap, there's Honda Accords everywhere, you can't unsee it, but there's some of those things that still have meaning to you. And they can be, the beautiful part is you don't need a man in a dark suit and a white shirt to tell you what they mean. Or to have some sort of discernment to tell you what God thinks they mean. Because you get to figure out what they mean for you, right? All right. So those are mainly the things that I wanted to talk about. I'll tell this experience about confirmation bias. One more thing. A couple years ago, my wife and I and our son and Jaden, our soon-to-be son-in-law at some point, we went to the British Museum, and I spent the whole day in the area about the Levant, about Israel and Canaanites and stuff like that. I don't know if that looks familiar to you, but that's Min right there. Joseph said that that's God on his throne, but that's Min with an erect penis. I don't know. And that's a book of breathings. That's kind of what the book of Abraham would have looked like, right? If it weren't like kind of torn up. And this is the Rosetta Stone. It's in the British Museum. That's how they really figured out what Egyptian characters meant. And there's a section on how writing developed. And it wasn't a 900-year-old Adam that invented writing in the Puritanic language before the Tower of Babel. Like, that's an origin story, right? So with my confirmation bias, because I had studied this stuff, I go there and I'm like, it's right in front of me the whole time. There were Honda Accords everywhere and I didn't see it. It was so humiliating, but it was so helpful to go through. So deconstruction is really important. So finally, I would say a few things. My experience in Mormonism, it's not everybody's experience. Some people didn't experience the privilege that I did. Some people experienced trauma, spiritual abuse. I mean, I experienced spiritual abuse. My patriarchal blessing indicates to me that my wife would die early. And so I would plead in God with prayer to not take her from me. So I experienced some, but nothing like some of my friends have, right? But there are a few things that happen in the church that provide a generational traumatic experience. And it's not, everyone doesn't experience this, but I did. And that is, bad feelings are not from God. which means that grief isn't from God, which means that processing grief isn't from God, which means that when you have cognitive dissonance because you're trying to hold competing thoughts, that's not from God. And so what happens, again, this isn't everyone's experience, but this was mine. When I would experience very difficult things, I would perceive that that was either Satan or because I wasn't faithful enough. And Brene Brown talks about how unprocessed trauma doesn't go away, it just festers. And so generationally, when you have individuals and generations not putting in the work to process trauma, grief, cognitive dissonance, abuse, spiritual abuse, that's, I would say shit, but that stuff, I just said it, that stuff that we want to talk about when we go through a faith crisis. Because processing emotion isn't evil. Being angry is part of burning the ground so that there can be new growth, rather than suppressing, processing difficulty. And over generations, it affects us. Like, my parents joined the church when I was 3. But my ancestors were all Mennonite, and they did the same thing. I mean, there are Mormons and there are Mennonites today that don't do this, right? But we did. You didn't process negative emotion. So part of these support groups, part of the reason that we deconstruct so hard, part of the reason that we want to talk about this stuff is this is grief work when we go through this. The loss of intimacy and trust and family relationships, the sense of loss of identity. If you really knew it was true and then found out that it wasn't, processing that is tough stuff. And so to sit and hold the hand of a stranger and listen to their story, to spend time with people, and if it's safe as an extrovert, to talk about your own story so that other people who it's not safe yet for them to talk about it, they can know they're not alone. That's important. That's important work. So it's important work that we do. So in the end, the church isn't ever going to go away. Sorry for those that want to burn it down. It's not. Because there are people that won't ever see the Honda Accords. There are people that experience the divinity and it continues to work for them their whole life. Their shelves don't crash. They're good people. My mission president is a good man. And he's in his 90s, working to baptize more people, right? He's a good person. Some of those things when in conference, when they get up and they say stuff, there's like, they know that's not true. I mean, maybe they do. Lying for the Lord is a thing. I mean, you probably all know that they've all received their second anointing, right? So I remember part of the apostasy, what great apostasy was that the Catholic Church would sell indiscretions. Indulgences, that's it. Indulgences, so that you were justified in doing whatever if you gave them money. Sounds really familiar. Rich, privileged people who get invited into the club to receive their second anointing, and their calling and election is made sure by this ordinance where an apostle like washes your feet and your wife gives you a blessing. You're justified in whatever you do, even if you're wrong. That's why you don't apologize, because God justifies you in what you did. That's what they believe, that, right? So I don't know. Maybe they really believe that. They can say, that Elder Ballard can say, from the beginning of time, there's never ever been any attempt to suppress or hide difficult information. And he knows that's not true, right? He knows it's not true. If he gets up and gives a talk about Jane Manning James without giving context of the spiritual and ecclesiastical abuse that happened to that woman, That's not honest, right? And he knows that. But it doesn't bring people to his version of God that he knows, right? So, or maybe because he got a second anointing, he can do that. I don't know. Anyway. So, in any event, that's kind of what I wanted to share. What I've done is I've continued to write and journal and participate in podcasts and come and do things like this. I created a support group in Billings, Montana. We have there's maybe 3,000 active members in our county-ish and then some. And we have about 70 people in our support group now. My guess is there are probably 300 or 500 people that need the kind of support that we give in the group. The challenge with groups like these is sometimes it's not a safe place for someone who's newly deconstructing. Like, I would have not felt comfortable coming here in May of 2016. It would have not been safe for me, right? So some of the times people need a safe landing place, but it's important that we do this work. And in any event, that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you for inviting me. So I left some time for questions or things like that, but
I said a prayer with his microphone. I got it to work.
How many times did you pray for it and it didn't work?
It's called the illusory truth.
Okay. All right.
Test your faith.
So if you have questions, why don't you come up to the front and use the microphone and then they can share it back and forth.
Yeah, or you can ask the question, I'll repeat it.
That's a better microphone, the one you've got.
No questions? I answered all of your burning questions?
I've got a couple.
Oh,
Okay.
please.
So when you said your wife is nuanced, I wonder where she's at with that. And then also, second question, where do you fall on the spectrum of belief in Jesus and God?
Okay. So the question is about my wife as a nuanced believer and where do I fall in my religious constructs with regard to God. So my wife, how far back do I go? I grew up with McConkie Hinckley Packer Mormonism. We read Mormon doctrine for family home evening. My wife's parents grew up with David O. McKay Mormonism, which was a very different version of Mormonism. Much more nuanced. There weren't worthiness interviews. It wasn't fundamentalist, literalist, Joseph Fielding Smith Mormonism. And my wife was raised as a David O. McKay Mormon, okay? So in any event, we were in a mixed faith marriage and I didn't know it because I was super black and white and she was nuanced along the way. So my wife continues to participate in the church, and I'm not going to tell her story, but I'll share 2 examples. When I was deconstructing and in the angry phase, we were on a walk one morning and I asked, how can you continue to support me even though I'm coming to all these disparate conclusions to things than you? How do you do that? Like, I didn't understand that. That didn't make any sense because 1 plus 2 is 3, right? And she said, it's like our son Nelson. I trust that our son didn't choose to be gay. And I trust that God would not want him to live a life absent the intimacy that we share. And so I trust our son, and I trust God, and I trust it'll all work out in the end. And that's how I feel about you. I don't believe you're making this up. This is a real experience for you. And I trust you, and I trust God, and I trust that it'll all work out in the end. I'm like, how do you do that? Like, but that's the level of nuance that she carries. So she's the only one left in the church. Our son's partner has resigned. I've resigned. Our son probably won't. He doesn't have unpacking or boundary setting to resign. He doesn't need that. Our daughter watched my Mormon Stories interview. She's seen how much happier our son is. Lives in Utah County, and she's a dance major who's more progressive in her religious beliefs. So she's not going to the church there. So in any event, but my wife experiences divinity in her participation, and she's an introvert. She's a very private person. She won't ever go on Mormon stories or Marriage on a Tightrope with me. And I'm writing a memoir that I might not ever be able to publish because she's a private person, and she's part of my story. The biggest breakthrough that we had was a couple years ago. And as a financial advisor, what I would tell people, like when the financial crisis happened, people are freaking out. What if the dollar isn't the reserve currency anymore, and the world ends, and cats and dogs sleeping together, and all this stuff? and I said, well, if there's a question that keeps you up at night, let's answer the question. You don't have to worry about it anymore. So what would you do if everything fell apart? Well, I'd want to own, a cabin in the woods that was stocked with, food, and I could hunt for food, and had a well on it, and I could live there. I'm like, okay, let's go have you buy a cabin. Now you don't have to worry about it anymore, right? So in any event, I kind of felt the same way with this. She was convinced that at some point I wouldn't be okay with her participating in the church, and choosing to not investigate the church, which that's a choice that she's made. And she's like, you're trying to make this okay, and it's not okay. And I'm like, well, I'm talking publicly about things in your private person, and that's not okay. And where we arrived at is we said, okay, let's answer the question. If it's no longer okay, how would we dissolve our marriage? And so we went through. I did a spreadsheet because I'm analytical. This is how we divide things up. You would be okay. I would be okay. I'd want you to remarry someone that that was really would treat you like you deserve to be treated. And then where we settled on was an idea probably related to secular application of Buddhism. Is we made a choice for it to be okay that it's not okay. So instead of trying to force it to be okay, we made a choice for it to be okay that it's not okay. My wife speaks different primary love languages than I do. And that's helped us grow and live in differentiation. And it's not as easy if I spoke the same love languages as her naturally, although I've become fluent, and she's become fluent. But we choose to be together even though we don't speak the same five love languages, or the same primary ones. And we choose for it to be okay that it's not okay. So I see her thrive, she sees me thrive, and we made a choice. And after that happened, our marriage got way better, and our confidence that we will probably still be together in the future went way up, because it wasn't working when we were trying to make something okay that wasn't. We just had to accept that it's not okay. So where do I lie on belief? So I lean somewhere between pantheism and panentheism. So I believe Jesus was a real person. I believe that the things written about him probably were somewhat embellished because they were written so late. There's probably some truth in some of those stories. I believe that the nativity story probably is more of a metaphor rather than, which is really tough for my believing Christian friends, but I think that scholarship is compelling that the beginning of Luke is a late addition, that whoever wrote Luke didn't actually write the nativity story in the Luke gospel. And so it's only the Gospel of Matthew, ignored by Paul, the writer of John, ignored by everyone else except for Matthew, most likely, and whoever added, likely, is my understanding, added it to Luke. but I experience significant value in many of the teachings attributed to Jesus. So pantheist is this idea that there's an animating divine force that exists in all things. And if I was speaking to a believing Mormon, I would say, you know that Spirit of Christ thing, where the Spirit of Christ was part of everything and animates and in all things and gives you your consciousness? If you stopped at that, that's where I believe, right? And if I attribute meaning to say that the kingdom of God is now, and that Jesus is Jesus and the Christ are different. The Christ is a symbol based on Jesus of divinity that exists in all of us and through us. Like, I can handle that. And so I love the symbol of Jesus. I love the symbol of Christ. I study more biblical scholarship now than I ever thought I would. I'm reading a new translation of the Old Testament that's a much better one than the King James Version. I continue to study New Testament scholarship. So I love that stuff. And the churches that I church hop to, that before COVID, like maybe once a month I would go to a church, they tend to be mainline Christian or Community of Christ. So, because like you can talk about Bart Ehrman there and not be considered an apostate. Or the United Church of Christ denomination that I went to, they'll actually have people from the Jesus Seminar come and talk about the historical Jesus. And they're LGBTQ affirming, and they usually have a female pastor. And I love talking about that stuff. That's beautiful. That trans-rational stuff, that's great. But I also experience just as much divinity being here today with you as I do there, or hiking in the mountains and so forth. So the constructs that I use the word God now, but to me, God is everything. And then pantheism goes a little bit more, and that goes towards the Richard Rohr side of things, that the divine force has a conscious, rather than the universe being God and we're having a temporary conscious experience as part of the universe. Pantheism goes a little bit further than that. So sometimes I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, no, that doesn't work for me. Anyway, that's kind of where I've landed. But if I sit down with a bunch of atheists and we talk about, man, that elevation emotion's pretty awesome. Let's go serve some people food at the homeless shelter. Like, let's do that. I love that elevation emotion. Let's go do that. I'd do that too.
What about the savior of the world thing?
It's not helpful for me to believe that the atonement theology that we're constantly fallen and separated from God, because I believe God is everything. So you can't be separated from God. You can live with dysfunction, but it's not helpful for me to believe that we're separated from God without a Savior. It doesn't work for me. But my wife experiences beauty in that, and that's okay. And my Mennonite family does too. So, and some of my friends here do too, right? And I think that's beautiful. So, in the back.
So I'm Corey Hofmeyer. Nice to meet you. Thank you. And so a lot of us live here in southern Utah, and you'll get kickback from communities when they find out that you left the church. I know in our town, I never know when somebody's going to come and see. So I'm guessing that maybe where you live, you get a little of that. How do you deal with it? Or how do you decide?
Yeah. So I gave this suggestion to Jarrett. Did he come today? My friend.
Can you repeat the question?
So the question is, how do you deal with people when you get pushback from them if you're not part of the in group, basically, right? So we were having a discussion at Thrive Day, Jarrett, and he was asking about that with regard to his kids. Like, my kids are getting taught this stuff. This is how I remember the story. My kids are getting taught this stuff, and I'm this evil apostate former bishop, and what do I do? And I said, I said, your kids are gonna experience elevation, motion, or spirit if they're participating in things that they think are morally good. So give them opportunities to do that, and they'll fill that with you, and so they'll disbelieve the BS that they're saying about you. So take your kids not only on a hike, take them to do service work, take them to the homeless shelter, come up with a project to like put shoes on kids, do that stuff, they'll feel it, and they'll feel that with you, and they'll know that what they're saying about you isn't true. So my answer is, do good. And they won't be able to deny that there's light in you. Because they will feel that when they're around you, because you're doing good with them. That's my answer. So I know I'm over time a couple minutes, but one of the first things that I did when I wasn't like angry, like I was angry for a period of time and depressed, one of the first things I did is I found out that one of the men, when I was high priest group leader, there was this family, a daughter the age of our son, with some health issues. And the wife ran the laundry at the Billings Temple, and the husband was pretty stubborn and old and failing in health. And they lived in a mobile home trailer that was like from the 1950s. It was falling apart. We would go over the high priest group and we would tar the roof and try to fix the stairs and level it out, fix the plumbing. And we're like, would you let us like raise money to buy you a replacement home? And the husband's like, no way, because that insulted his ego. Like, we bought this, I own it, no way. I found out that his Alzheimer's got really bad and he was put in a nursing home. And as soon as I found out, I'm like, we're gonna do this. So my wife and I created an irrevocable trust. And we created this trust, and then we got 2 people from the LDS community that everyone knew to be trustees. And the first trustee was a woman, and the second trustee was a long-term home teacher of this family. And we went to the wife and we said, we would like to buy you a replacement home, and we're gonna put it in an irrevocable trust so that Medicaid can't touch it if you die before your husband, or if you get sick someday, that your daughter can live in it, even if she's on Medicaid, because she's disabled. And she accepted it. So we raised $28,000, and we bought her a replacement home. And we got companies to volunteer to do the electrical and earthwork to level it out. And I got people from her ward and from the state to go in and help me clean and do all of that. And my friends felt God in that. And I did too. There were some of my friends who would not, because I am the apostate, capital T, capital A. But many did. And it made a difference in their lives, in this woman and her daughter. But it also made a difference in the lives of the people who chose to participate inside and outside of the church. So that was several years ago. We haven't done that in a while. But I think that's how you do it, is you do things where they experience what they would call God in it. And then they're more likely to hold grace. Anyway, thank you.
Wow.